Ben ritrovati. I complotti, le cospirazioni sono qualcosa che ci accompagna da sempre, dai tempi di Giulio Cesare, poi ci ricordiamo casi incredibili come il Watergate che ha costretto il presidente Nixon a dare le dimissioni negli Stati Uniti, il caso Irangate, le armi di distruzione di massa di Saddam Hussein inesistenti che sono servite per scatenare una guerra. Insomma, non mancano i veri complotti, però sul web dilagano invece le discussioni molto accese su complotti del tutto immaginari, le scie chimiche, QAnon, oppure per cose che hanno interpretazioni e spiegazioni di tipo diverso. Oggi per parlare di questi argomenti abbiamo con noi uno dei massimi esperti dell'argomento, il professor Stephan Lewandowsky. Benvenuto.
Well, thanks for having me. That's a great question. I think let me start at the end and then work backwards. Why do people believe in misinformation and conspiracy theories in these circumstances? I think the answer for that is pretty well understood. And basically what's happening is that whenever people feel that they've lost control or they have a sense of fear and not being able to control their lives, that is when some people become susceptible to misinformation, in particular conspiracy theories. And the reason for that is that somewhat ironically, perhaps, believing in a conspiracy is comforting psychologically. Because if you can blame something on bad people, that's somehow, for some people, much easier to do than to accept the fact that this is effectively a random event. You know, this virus jumped from an animal to a human, and now we're all facing the consequences. And, you know, that's fairly frightening to have a huge event, a world-changing event like this, being caused by effectively a random event. So that's why people believe in conspiracy theories. And there's nothing surprising about it. They've been doing this for hundreds of years. You know, in the Middle Ages, when there was a plague, then they blamed it on the Jews and anti-Semitism erupted. And, you know, this sort of thing happens. We just know that people do that. So then the next question is, you know, what are these conspiracy theories like, and how can we tell whether something is a conspiracy theory? Because one of the problems is that, of course, there are real conspiracies in the world. You know, I mean, we can think of a lot in politics, you know, Watergate, Iran, Contra, and I'm sure Italy has its own share of
absolutely
of real conspiracies.
Yes.
So how do we know that if somebody is proposing a conspiracy that they're not actually thinking about something real, but they're making up this theory? Well, I would argue that one of the cues that you can use is how people think when they talk about their conspiracy theories. What is their rhetoric? What is their argumentation? And the argument is this: human cognition is pretty good at tracking reality. If we look at people's performance, we're actually pretty good. Maybe not perfect, definitely not perfect, but we're pretty good. And we have a very good understanding mathematically and philosophically what it means for cognition to be a good device to track reality. You know, we know how we should respond to evidence to maximize our knowledge, for example. Now, if you then look at people who believe in conspiracy theories, it turns out that they violate all those assumptions about what makes cognition optimal or what makes cognition track reality so well. And if somebody is thinking in a way that violates everything we know about how they should be thinking to understand reality, then chances are that they probably are not very good at tracking reality. You know, it's not a proof, but it's a pretty good hint. So let me give you some examples of what I mean by that. One of the things about conspiracy theories that I always find remarkable and interesting is that they tend to be internally contradictory and incoherent. So the theory will contain contradictions. In the case of COVID, there's a wonderful example. In fact, it was some internet video thing that went around where some pseudoscientist was being interviewed about COVID, and she said, well, the virus has been with us since we were children, and it was given to us through vaccinations. And now, 20 or 30 years later, it was unleashed because we started wearing masks. Now, that's complete nonsense, of course. Total complete nonsense. But what is more interesting than just the fact that that's nonsense is that in the same interview, minutes later, the same person said, oh, the virus was invented in a weapons laboratory in China and was unleashed on the world in January, right? Well, hang on. That doesn't hang together.
Yep.
I mean, either it's a biological weapon or, we've had it all our lives and the masks are triggering it. It can't be both. Now, as it happens, both of those things are nonsense. But you see, once something is incoherent and we discover that, we don't even have to worry about whether one or the other thing is factual, because the contradiction invalidates the theory. Reality does not contradict itself. We're not both pregnant and not pregnant at the same time. The Earth isn't round and flat. It happens to be round. It's not also flat. So that is one sort of way in which we can identify when a theory is likely, very likely, to be just a conspiracy theory and not an actual conspiracy or not valuable information. And once you understand that and you have a look around, then it becomes pretty easy to kind of look at somebody or some argument and say, well, actually, no, that's probably not so good.
Professor Lewandowsky, lei è uno scienziato cognitivo all'Università di Bristol ed è riconosciuto in tutto il mondo come uno dei principali esperti nel modo in cui la disinformazione funziona, nel modo in cui le bufale, o quelle che oggi vengono chiamate fake news, si diffondono. Nel corso degli ultimi mesi abbiamo visto una vera e propria epidemia di disinformazione, una vera infodemia, come si dice, oltre naturalmente alla vera e propria epidemia virale del coronavirus, che si è diffusa in tutta la società. Che cosa, secondo lei, quali secondo lei sono le caratteristiche di una simile infodemia e perché siamo così attratti da idee tanto improbabili?
Yes, we do have a fair degree of knowledge about that. So they tend to be people who feel disenfranchised, who feel left behind, and who even outside the pandemic don't feel that they have the life that they feel entitled to. I mean, if you ask people about how much they feel a part of society and how much they trust institutions and all that, then you find it's usually people who feel left out and who distrust everything. They distrust governments and the media and academics and the establishment and their neighbors and the bus driver. You find that they're very low on trust. And that's why not everybody buys into conspiracy theories. It's only a certain number of people who do. And we get a fairly good idea of who these people are. So we can sort of predict on the basis of various attributes how likely they are to believe in conspiracy theories.
Le teorie del complotto tendono a semplificare la realtà e ci aiutano a dare un significato al mondo che per tanti sembra troppo caotico per essere accettato. Quali, secondo lei, sono le caratteristiche psicologiche di coloro che abbracciano le teorie della cospirazione?
Yeah, look, that's a very interesting question. And it's actually fascinating to watch or to trace back how conspiracy theories arise. Because what tends to happen, if you look at the origin of these things, is that they're being tried out in chat rooms on the internet. Mm-hmm. People, like usually it's right-wing extremist chat rooms that are kind of cooking up this stuff. And then not everything from there goes mainstream or goes viral on Facebook or on Twitter or whatever. A lot of things just die. And so what I think is actually happening is that there's sort of an evolutionary experiment among like-minded people who kind of talk to each other, and then something clicks, and bang, then it takes off. Now we can say a few things ahead of time about what that's likely to be, but I think it is also quite random and very difficult to predict. So what I can tell you right now is probably that it's going to be very emotional. It's going to attract our emotion, probably a very negative emotion. I mean, no misinformation is ever happy. You know, it's very unlikely.
Yeah.
It's much more likely that it is something, you know, a dark, sort of terrifying, you know, sinister conspiracy. You know, Bill Gates is implanting microchips in our heads, that sort of thing. And some of it is outlandish, like the Bill Gates idea, because if it is totally outlandish, a lot of people will share it because they think it's funny or outlandish. But it doesn't matter, because the more this kind of thing spreads, the more attention it gets, the more some people will believe it. Or even if they don't believe it, they'll be affected by it, because another thing we know from conspiracy theories is that just being exposed to one is sufficient for people to reduce their engagement with society and politics. And so just being exposed to this nonsense about Bill Gates makes people back off a little. And so it doesn't even have to be believed to cause damage. So we know it's got to be emotional. It can be preposterous. That doesn't seem to be, you know, that's never slowed down anything. And beyond that, to be honest, I think it's kind of hard to predict. I mean, of course, it has to be anti-establishment. Otherwise, it wouldn't be a conspiracy theory, right? So it'll never be something that says, oh, the medical scientists are doing a fantastic job because they profiled the virus in 2 weeks. Which they did, and which is stunning. It's a stunning accomplishment that we know as much about the virus as we do. Well, no misinformation would ever go there or exaggerate that. It would all be instead saying, oh, these evil doctors are being paid by the pharmaceutical industry or George Soros or Bill Gates, you know. So we know it'll be anti-establishment, it'll be dark, it'll contain accusations, it'll you know, it'll sort of appeal to our negative emotions. But whether it's Bill Gates or George Soros who becomes the bad guy, I don't think you can tell that ahead of time. That is sort of, you know, it could be anyone, it could be you or me.
Certamente. Quando lei pensa una teoria del complotto si trasforma in una credenza quasi religiosa, come in QAnon, che ormai è diventata una setta che attende una rivelazione?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, it depends on how far you want to draw the analogy with religion. I mean, the thing about religion is that by definition, and I don't think I'm offending anybody when I say that, by definition, it's not based on evidence. I mean, it's not supposed to be. Religion is about faith. If you don't have faith, then you can't be religious. You got to believe in something. Now, with a conspiracy theory, we can say, well, that's a very similar situation, because a conspiracy theory may claim to be on evidence, so they say, but when you actually look at it, there is no evidence there at all. And this is another interesting thing, both about, I mean, it applies to QAnon, but also COVID conspiracy theories, which is that if you ask a conspiracy theorist, well, why is there no evidence for this massive cover-up between the Center for Disease Control and Bill Gates and all that? You know, there's no evidence, so why should I believe that there's a cover-up? And their response is, oh, you see how clever they are? They are hiding their tracks so well. They're trying so hard for us not to see this cover-up that there is no evidence for it. Don't you get it? Right? So it's kind of like using the absence of evidence as evidence for the conspiracy.
Yes.
Because they're so good, there's no evidence. And I think QAnon is in many ways falls into that because, I mean, there's absolutely no evidence for any of this stuff. But that's sort of the point, because the absence of evidence is underscoring this evil, powerful conspiracy that is so powerful that they don't leave any traces.
Absolutely.
And in that sense, it becomes like religion, because if you're not concerned about evidence, then you can make up anything you want.
Come lei sa, i seguaci di queste credenze sono convinti che ci sarà presto una rivelazione, uno showdown. Lo sostengono da quando Trump è stato eletto 4 anni fa. C'è l'attesa di una rivelazione messianica proprio come in una setta millenarista che aspetta la fine del mondo, che però non arriva mai.
It doesn't come, and then, totally. Well, absolutely. And, well, I think what's going on there is that once people have invested faith or trust in something like that, it becomes extremely difficult for them to then walk away from that investment. It's like any other investment. You look at what people do with money. Well, the most frequent error people make with money is that they throw good money after bad. You know, people keep spending money on something that doesn't work, or they're trying to save something that's a lost cause. You know, 3 years later, it turns out if they walked away from it at the beginning, they would be hundreds of thousands of euros ahead, and yet people don't do that. And I think it's because they feel invested and they don't want to lose, so they invest more. And I think sects and conspiracy theories are a lot like that. And in fact, if you look at how you can deal with hardcore conspiracy theorists when you try to talk to them, and how you can try and deprogram cult members, you find surprising similarities in the depth of their belief and commitment. I mean, people don't just walk away from a cult sort of, overnight. Quite on the contrary, it's a very long, painful process, requires a lot of support, a lot of therapy, really. And the same is true for hardcore conspiracy theorists. I mean, they're not going to walk away from their QAnon theory overnight. That's their life. They're committed to that. That's their identity. And of course, it's a very small number of people who go down the rabbit hole that deep, but some of them do. Once they're down there, it's extremely difficult to reach them and to get them out.
Se dovessimo fare una lista di 10 regole, chiamiamole così, indispensabili, che secondo lei sono obbligatorie, no? Che sono sempre presenti quando qualcuno vuole creare una falsa notizia e vuole fare in modo che sembri vera, ecco, quali dovrebbero essere secondo lei?
Well, first of all, let's talk about the making things worse. I think that's a very difficult question and very nuanced. Now, if no one knows about some ridiculous conspiracy theory that's out there, let's say somebody says it's the flying spaghetti monster that is eating up all the streetlights in Venice. Okay, I mean, some complete total just nonsense. Now, if no one knows about that except 3 people on Facebook, is there any point in debunking that? Well, no, I don't think so, because why would you draw attention to that? It is just adding more noise. It is just perpetuating this surplus of noise on the internet and in public discourse. So I think you probably could make things worse in that situation simply by making it more popular. However, having said that, in actual experiments, when we do controlled experiments and we correct people's beliefs, we find that in 9 or almost 10 out of 10 cases, that is actually effective and helpful. So that is not making things worse. There are very few occasions when you get this backfire effect and you're worse off than if you had done nothing. However, they're very rare, and they only occur with some people some of the time, if you challenge things that are extremely important to their worldview, to their identity. Other than that, correcting people works as a first approximation. However, here is the problem. It only works at one level. That is, if I correct people's misconceptions and I then ask them afterwards to tell me what their belief is, they will rationally and correctly tell me, oh, I changed my mind. And that's great. So that's a first step. That works really well. But here is the second level. The second level is people's attitudes and people's behaviors. And it turns out that in most instances, those are much, much harder to shift. For example, there's a whole bunch of papers that came out over the last couple of years. I authored some of them, where we show that you can correct voters' beliefs about statements by Donald Trump. If Donald Trump said something wrong, you can say to them, well, actually, he wasn't right about that. And people update their beliefs, even people who support Donald Trump. They say, oh, okay, he was wrong. They accept that. Even a week later, they still know that that was wrong. But it makes no difference to how they feel about Donald Trump or their voting intentions. So there's this decoupling between knowing something being false, and it actually has no effect. And the same is true in other circumstances where we can show that people know that something was false and you tell them that's wrong and they say, oh, okay, I know that's wrong. But then they still seem to make use of the original information. So that's the tricky part. We can shift people's, what they say, but we don't always shift the implications of that. It may not affect their attitudes. It may not affect how they use the information. They may use the information even if they know it's wrong. That paradoxical behavior is quite common. And that's what makes it difficult.
Nei suoi studi lei ha avuto la possibilità di capire quanto è difficile sradicare le false credenze, no? Smontare i complotti, ma ha anche capito come è rischioso farlo, perché si rischia appunto di diffondere ancora di più la disinformazione, rendendola più familiare a chi l'ascolta, semplicemente per il fatto che si ripetono quelle che sono bugie, anche solo per smontarle. E allora quali sono i consigli che lei darebbe a chi desidera sì smontare le bufale, ma facendolo nel modo più appropriato per non peggiorare la situazione?
Yeah, well, that seems to be something that is working reasonably well. If you warn people ahead of time that they might be misinformed, and in particular, if you tell them ahead of time how they would be misinformed, that is when you can show that people become resilient to misinformation. And that is why I think it's so important, as we started out in the conversation, it's important to understand how conspiracy theories are constructed and that they're incoherent. Because if people know that ahead of time and they kind of look out for incoherence and then they discover it, well, then chances are they're not going to be as likely to believe that theory because they know, hey, that's kind of weird, you know, that doesn't sound right. So that's why I think it's important to understand the rhetoric underlying misleading information so you can warn people against that. And there's reasonably good evidence for that, and we're working on that right now. I mean, that's one of my projects right now, to establish that more clearly.
Lei ha descritto un processo particolarmente interessante e utile, no? Per favorire così una mentalità più critica, che ha chiamato pre-banking e che precede, se vogliamo, il debunking, ma che ha l'effetto quasi di una vaccinazione e mette in guardia così le persone contro le bufale. Come funziona?
That's the hard part, isn't it? Because when you're personally involved in that, well, I don't have a silver bullet. I wish I could say, just do this and then everything will be fine. Well, I can't say that. I don't have anything at my disposal that I can help with. I mean, there's a couple of things that I might suggest. I mean, the first thing is talk to everybody else in the family, not that person. In other words, get a message out about, what's really happening that finds traction with everybody else, regardless of Uncle Bruce or whoever it is, cousin Giovanni or somebody. There's always somebody out there who's like that. I know. I got a family too. So that's one thing you can do. The other thing you can do, if you really want to invest in that, is to try and do what people do who are trying to help others leave a cult, which is to offer some sort of support by being empathic. Instead of saying, "Oh, you're just an idiot," say something nice and say, "Well, and I appreciate where you're coming from. I understand, and skepticism is a really good thing, and I'm glad you're skeptical. But you know what? Maybe you also want to be skeptical of the stuff you believe, not just what I believe, but what you believe. Let's try that." And then, if they want to engage, if they're interested, then over time you can gently lead them out of that. But they it takes a long time, and then you have to invest a lot of time and effort. And then what you've done is to change one person.
Yes.
It's probably better to invest all that effort in the rest of the world, trying to make them resilient to conspiracy theories in the first place. You always got to figure out, where am I going to spend my effort? And I don't spend any effort myself, and I don't recommend spending it on hardcore climate deniers or conspiracy theorists or anti-vaccination activists. It's much more important to spend time inoculating the rest of the population against that by pointing out their misleading argumentation. I think that's just a better bang for the buck.
È d'accordo anche lei nel dire che un atteggiamento, un modo più utile a lungo termine, un approccio più utile nell'affrontare la disinformazione non è tanto quello di smontare ogni singola bufala che esce, ma anzi aiutare, incoraggiare una mentalità più critica nelle nuove generazioni?
Yes, I think so too. It's crucial, and not just critical thinking. We've been doing this in universities for a long time, and what it has done is to turn people into, the students turn into people who say, "Oh, I'm very critical, and here's a problem with this study or whatever, this scientific finding." Well, and half the time there isn't a problem. Teaching people critical thinking often leads to them thinking, "Oh, well, I don't believe anything. I'm going to be a critical thinker now. I'm going to criticize everything. Nothing is right. The earth is round. Well, no, I'm a critical thinker. I'm not going to believe that." So I think what we really have to do is to teach people critical differentiation between things that are likely to be true and things that are very unlikely to be true. We can't, create generations of cynics who believe nothing. Right. We got to get people to believe things that are worth believing. And it's sort of intuitive, but I think we sometimes underemphasize that. So for me, it's more a matter of differentiation, not of being critical of everything. I'm not critical of mathematical textbooks, for example. I believe what it says in there. I'm assuming that once it's on the market and it has been edited and no one has found an error in it, that the theorems in there are true. So, but I am very critical of things I read on the internet. If some dude is tweeting something about COVID, I'm not going to believe it. So we have to learn differentiation. And fortunately, there are ways in which we can teach people to do that on the internet. There are some really fairly simple things you can teach people. For example, that to evaluate the credibility of a source, don't look at just that website and see what they say about themselves. That only gets you so far. That probably can tell you whether they know how to spell. And that's a first step, okay? If it's not all misspelled, then maybe that's good. But it doesn't tell you how credible it is. To find that out, and this is what fact checkers do, what you have to do is you open a whole bunch of other tabs, and then you look what other people say about that website. And you see whether other people have identified it as a hoax. or whether other people, and who these other people are who think it's a good thing. So if the New York Times says, oh, that website is great, well, that's kind of reasonable. I'm not saying, the New York Times is the gold standard, but, if it's only right-wing or left-wing extremist websites who like that one, then I have reason to be skeptical. So that's one of the things you can teach people very quickly. And they become much better at differentiating true from false information, even after just a week of practicing.
Un'ultima domanda. Ha per caso qualche libro in uscita?
I just published a little handbook called the Conspiracy Theory Handbook, which is available online. You just got to Google that, Conspiracy Theory Handbook. And what that does is summarize a lot of literature about conspiracy theories, and it's free, and it's only about 10 or 12 pages. But it contains a lot of information, pretty much everything we've discussed today, plus a lot of other things about how to debunk conspiracy theories. And we have another handbook forthcoming, scheduled for completion in September. That's about debunking more generally. So that's a few months away, but watch this space.
Grazie professor Lewandowsky per essere stato con noi al CCAP Fest. La sua esperienza e i suoi studi sono sempre preziosi per tutti noi che ci occupiamo di questi argomenti. Ci auguriamo di vederla ancora.
Thanks for having me.
E grazie a voi per averci seguito, e il CCAP Fest continua.